Emma lived on Hawthorne Lane, a street that seemed as ordinary as any suburban neighborhood. The houses were neatly aligned, their lawns trimmed with precision, and the residents were polite but distant. It was the kind of place where people exchanged nods rather than conversations, and Emma had always been fine with that. But there was one house that stood out, not for its appearance, but for the unsettling air that surrounded it. The house at the very end of the cul-de-sac, owned by Mrs. Delacroix. Mrs. Delacroix was a mystery. She rarely came outside, and when she did, it was only for the bare necessities. Her face was pale, her movements deliberate, and her gaze sharp, as though she could see straight through a person. No one on the street seemed to know much about her, which only added to the intrigue. Emma had never seen visitors at her house, and the few delivery people who came left packages at the gate, always looking eager to leave. It wasn't until the peculiar noises began that Emma started paying closer attention. On some nights, when the neighborhood was silent and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves, Emma would hear faint, unidentifiable sounds coming from Mrs. Delacroix's house. Sometimes it was a low hum, like a mechanical drone. Other times, it was more unsettling, a soft tapping as though someone was knocking from deep within the walls. One night, she could have sworn she heard a muffled cry, but when she stepped onto her porch to listen closer, the sound stopped abruptly. Her curiosity turned to unease when she noticed an eerie glow coming from one of the upstairs windows. It wasn't the warm yellow light of a lamp, but a cold bluish hue that flickered erratically. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in that house was anything but ordinary. She mentioned it casually to her neighbor, Karen, during a brief chat about gardening. Karen's face turned pale, and she quickly changed the subject, muttering something about minding your own business before hurrying back into her home. Emma tried to dismiss her suspicions as overactive imagination, but the feeling of something being wrong only grew stronger. She started noticing more details. The curtains in Mrs. Delacroix's windows never moved, even on the breeziest days. There were no signs of life in the yard. No weeds to pull, no flowers to water, not even a bird bath to attract the occasional sparrow. The mailbox was often stuffed with letters, but Emma never saw anyone retrieve them. Then came the moment that sealed Emma's decision to investigate further. While taking her trash to the curb one night, she noticed a man standing at Mrs. Delacroix's gate. He was tall, dressed in a black coat, and held a package wrapped in brown paper. The man glanced around nervously before slipping the package through the gate and walking away briskly. Emma watched from the shadows, her heart pounding. What was in that package? And why did he seem so afraid? That night, as Emma lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she resolved to find out what was happening in her neighbor's house. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, a need to understand the truth about the strange woman at the end of the street. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking just beyond the walls of Mrs. Delacroix's house. After the mysterious delivery, her curiosity morphed into a gnawing obsession. She began keeping an eye on the house whenever she could, jotting down every odd occurrence in a small notebook she kept tucked in her kitchen drawer. She didn't entirely understand why she was doing it. It wasn't as though she intended to report anything. Yet, the house and its secrets had a pull on her she couldn't resist. Over the next week, Emma noticed even stranger things. A foul odor began wafting from Mrs. Delacroix's property, especially at dusk when the wind carried it toward her house. It was sharp and acrid, like something rotting or burning, and it made her stomach churn. On one occasion, she saw Mrs. Delacroix herself at the edge of the property, staring at the mailbox. The old woman didn't move for several minutes, standing as still as a statue with her back to the street. When she finally turned and shuffled back to the house, Emma thought she saw her holding something small and dark in her hands, though she couldn't make out what it was. The odd deliveries continued, but the people making them seemed more peculiar with each passing day. One evening, a woman in a long, hooded coat dropped off a package and then lingered near the gate, glancing nervously at the house before hurriedly walking away. Another time, a man arrived just before sunrise, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat, and left a box so large it required him to drag it across the pavement. Emma wanted to approach them, to ask what they were delivering and why. But something about their anxious movements kept her rooted in place, watching silently from her window. Emma's unease grew into dread when she noticed other neighbors' reactions, or lack thereof. When she brought up the strange deliveries to Sarah, the friendly woman who lived across the street, Sarah's cheerful demeanor shifted instantly. She muttered something vague about not wanting to get involved and abruptly ended the conversation. The next day, Emma tried to bring it up with Mark, the retired firefighter who loved to chat about local gossip. He stared at her in silence for a moment before saying, "Some doors are better left unopened," and walking away. That evening, Emma found a note slipped under her door. The paper was thin and yellowed, the edges curling with age. The message, scrawled in shaky handwriting, sent a shiver down her spine. "Leave her alone. You don't know what you're dealing with." Emma's hands trembled as she held the note, her mind racing. Who had left it? One of the neighbors? One of the strange visitors? Or worse, Mrs. Delacroix herself? Despite the warning, Emma couldn't bring herself to stop. If anything, the note only solidified her resolve. Someone didn't want her to know the truth, and that made her more determined than ever to uncover it. Emma spent the next few days planning her visit to Mrs. Delacroix's house. The warning note still haunted her, but it only sharpened her determination. She couldn't explain the pull, why she felt so compelled to figure out what was going on behind those darkened windows. Every strange delivery, every flicker of that cold blue light, every shadowy figure added to the weight pressing on her chest. She knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. Her opportunity came on a drizzly Thursday afternoon. Emma watched as a delivery truck arrived at Mrs. Delacroix's gate. A man stepped out, carrying a small wooden crate, but instead of leaving it at the gate as usual, he knocked on the door. For the first time, Emma saw Mrs. Delacroix answer it. The old woman appeared in the doorway, her frail frame silhouetted against the dim light inside. She took the crate with a nod and then shut the door, leaving the delivery man to hurry back to his truck without a backward glance. Emma waited until the truck pulled away before grabbing a small box she'd prepared, a decoy parcel she could use as an excuse to knock on Mrs. Delacroix's door. Emma's heart pounded as she crossed the street, the damp air clinging to her skin. The house loomed larger up close, its paint peeling and windows smudged with grime. The faint stench she'd noticed before was stronger now, a mix of decay and something chemical. She forced herself to approach the door, the wooden steps creaking ominously under her weight. Holding her breath, she knocked twice. It took several seconds, but eventually, the door creaked open just enough for Mrs. Delacroix's face to appear. Up close, she looked even older than Emma had thought. Her skin was pale and papery, her eyes sunken and surrounded by dark shadows. Her lips were thin and pressed tightly together, as though the act of speaking would cost her something precious. "Yes?" Mrs. Delacroix said, her voice low and rasping. "Hi, I think this package was delivered to my house by mistake," Emma stammered, holding up the box. "I believe it's yours." Mrs. Delacroix's eyes flicked to the package, then back to Emma's face. For a moment, she didn't say anything. The silence stretched uncomfortably until the old woman finally opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Emma hesitated, but stepped over the threshold. The air inside was thick and oppressive, carrying the same acrid smell that hung around the house. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with faded wallpaper, and cluttered with stacks of old newspapers and books. A faint humming noise, almost imperceptible, seemed to vibrate through the walls. Emma's stomach churned, but she forced a polite smile as she followed Mrs. Delacroix into the living room. The room was crowded with furniture that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Dust coated every surface, but what struck Emma most were the objects. Strange, unidentifiable items were arranged on shelves and tables. Glass jars filled with murky liquids, dried herbs hanging in bunches, and what looked disturbingly like animal bones. Emma's gaze was drawn to a door at the far end of the room. Unlike the rest of the house, the door was new, its wood polished, and its handle gleaming. From behind it came that faint humming, now slightly louder. Before Emma could say anything, Mrs. Delacroix's voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have come here." Emma turned to find the old woman staring at her, her expression unreadable. "I'll take the package now," Mrs. Delacroix said, her hand outstretched. Emma handed it over, her palms slick with sweat. She forced a smile and murmured an excuse to leave, retreating toward the door. As she stepped outside, the humming stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that lingered in her mind long after she'd returned home. The days following Emma's unsettling visit to Mrs. Delacroix's house were a blur of restless nights and haunted thoughts. She couldn't shake the image of the old woman's cold gaze, nor could she rid herself of the sense that something deeply disturbing was happening within those walls. Despite the unease that clung to her, Emma knew she had to go back. There was something behind that door, the one she'd seen at the end of the living room hallway, that called to her, and she could not ignore it any longer. On a quiet evening, when she knew Mrs. Delacroix was likely to be out for her weekly grocery run, Emma prepared herself for what she had to do. She dressed in dark clothes, hoping to blend into the shadows, and waited until the street was nearly empty before making her move. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and damp. The light was dim, casting an unsettling glow on the street as she walked towards the house at the end of the lane. Her heart raced, but her resolve was unwavering. She approached the house from the side, staying out of view of the front door. The windows were shut tight, but the faint glow she had seen before still flickered from behind one of them. Emma's pulse quickened as she slipped to the back of the house. There was a small, unlocked window just slightly ajar, and though the idea of breaking in made her stomach twist, she knew this was the only way to get answers. With a glance over her shoulder, she slid through the window and found herself inside the dimly lit kitchen. The smell of decay hit her immediately, stronger than before. It was overwhelming, sour and sharp, like something alive had been trapped in here for far too long. Emma held her breath, trying not to gag, and moved quickly through the narrow hallway toward the living room. The house seemed even darker now, the air thick with the weight of its secrets. She moved silently, stepping lightly over the uneven floorboards, until she reached the door at the end of the hall. The humming was louder now, a steady, rhythmic sound, like a machine that never stopped. The door loomed in front of her, solid and imposing, but there was a faint crack of light peeking out from the edges. Emma hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the door handle. What if she was wrong? What if her suspicions had all been in her head, and she was about to uncover something that would destroy her peace of mind forever? She had a fleeting moment of doubt, but it passed as quickly as it came. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything Emma had expected. It wasn't a simple storage space or a forgotten closet. It was a hidden chamber, meticulously organized yet utterly chilling. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars, some small, some large, containing preserved creatures, strange liquids, and odd, unsettling objects. There were animal bones arranged in neat patterns on tables, and what appeared to be hand-drawn diagrams pinned to the walls, their meaning indecipherable but undeniably dark. The air inside the room felt heavier, thicker, and the humming noise seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Emma stepped further into the room, her breath shallow, her body tense with a mixture of fear and fascination. At the center of the room was an altar, draped with dark cloth and surrounded by candles that burned with an unnatural flame, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room was suffused with an unsettling energy that made Emma's skin crawl. It was a place of rituals, she realized, a place where something ancient and terrifying was happening. As she moved closer to the altar, she saw it, an open journal, its pages filled with frantic handwriting. The ink was smudged, as though written in haste or fear, but the words were unmistakable. The ritual is nearly complete. One more soul and the power will be mine. The neighbors are closer than ever. A cold chill ran down Emma's spine as she read the words. The realization hit her like a wave. Mrs. Delacroix was not just a recluse. She was involved in something far darker than Emma had ever imagined. Before she could process the full weight of her discovery, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Emma spun around, her heart pounding. She had to leave. There was no time to waste. Just as she turned to run, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Delacroix stepped into the room, her eyes narrowing when she saw Emma standing by the altar. Emma froze, her body trembling, as the old woman's lips curled into a slow, menacing smile. Emma's heart thundered in her chest as she stood frozen in Mrs. Delacroix's hidden room, the door swinging open behind her. The old woman's shadow loomed larger in the doorway, her frail frame silhouetted by the dim light of the room. Mrs. Delacroix's smile was not warm. It was cold, calculating, and it sent a chill crawling up Emma's spine. For a long moment, the two women simply stared at each other, neither moving. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and Emma could barely breathe, let alone form a coherent thought. Her mind raced, trying to find an escape, a way to break free of the nightmare unfolding before her. Finally, Mrs. Delacroix spoke, her voice a low rasp that seemed to echo in the silence. "I knew you would come." Emma's mouth went dry. "What is this? What have you been doing in here?" The old woman stepped further into the room, her bony fingers brushing against the edge of the altar as she moved. "You shouldn't have come, child," she said, her tone almost regretful. "Now you know too much, and there's no going back." Emma's mind reeled. The words echoed in her ears, but they didn't make sense. She had come here looking for answers, but now that she had found them, she wished she hadn't. Her eyes flicked to the journal on the altar, the words she had read, the unsettling rituals, the dark power Mrs. Delacroix was trying to summon. It all came crashing down on her in an instant, the weight of the truth crushing her like a tidal wave. "You've been taking people," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "The disappearances. It's you." Mrs. Delacroix's smile widened, though there was no humor in it. "Oh, I don't take them, dear. I offer them. It's the way of things. They come willingly, seeking the power, the knowledge, the immortality, and when they do, I take what is offered to me in return." Emma's blood ran cold. She knew she had to leave, but her feet felt like they were made of lead. Mrs. Delacroix's words held a terrible weight, a terrible truth, and Emma's mind struggled to process it all. This was more than just a madwoman's delusion. The room, the objects, the journal, everything pointed to something ancient, something dark, something that had been happening in this very house for years. "You're a part of it now, you know?" Mrs. Delacroix continued, her voice growing quieter but more insistent. "You've seen it. You've learned too much. It won't be long before the ritual is complete, and you will belong to me." Emma's eyes widened in terror. She couldn't let that happen. She had to escape. But as she backed away from the altar, Mrs. Delacroix's frail form suddenly seemed to grow taller, her hands outstretched toward Emma with an unnatural speed. The old woman's once delicate frame now seemed to be suffused with an unsettling energy, as though something inside her had awakened, something ancient and powerful. The humming, which had been faint before, now roared in her ears. The room seemed to pulse with life, as though the very walls were alive, watching, waiting. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she turned to flee. But before she could take a step, Mrs. Delacroix's voice pierced the air, sharp and commanding. "You will not leave." The force of the words slammed into Emma's chest like a physical blow, freezing her in place. She fought against it, pushing against the invisible weight that held her. But it was no use. Mrs. Delacroix had power, an ancient dark power, and Emma had stumbled into the middle of something far beyond her comprehension. But there was one thing Emma still had, her wits. And even as fear gripped her, she knew she had to fight back. Her mind raced for an escape, for a way to break free. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the open window she had entered through. It was her only chance. With a surge of adrenaline, Emma bolted toward the window, throwing her body through it with all her might. She felt the sharp edge of the glass tear at her skin, but she didn't stop. She tumbled onto the wet grass outside, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her ears. Behind her, the door to the house slammed open with a deafening crash. Mrs. Delacroix stood in the doorway, her eyes burning with fury. "You cannot escape what you have seen," she called, her voice filled with a strange, otherworldly resonance. "The ritual has already begun." Emma didn't look back. She couldn't. She ran, her feet pounding against the wet earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The neighborhood seemed miles away, but she kept running, fueled by terror and the desperate need to survive. She didn't stop until she reached her house, slamming the door behind her and bolting it shut. She collapsed against the door, her body trembling uncontrollably. But even as she sat there, gasping for air, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Delacroix wasn't done with her. The old woman's words lingered in her mind, haunting her. You cannot escape what you have seen. The truth had been uncovered, but Emma knew in that moment that the horror was far from over. It was only just beginning.